and she's gonna call Brad from the airport and say, could you come pick me up?
Where is she going again?
Baku, Azerbaijan.
Where the heck? That's in the Russia.
Yeah.
Former Russian Republic.
Yeah. That's his part of the world.
Okay, I have some charts that are so tiny in the print, but it was the only way that I couldn't enlarge it or anything else. So it's going to require a magnifying glass, or like I have to do, take off my glasses and read it up close. But see what I mean? It's pretty awful. But this was the only one I could find that had what I wanted on there, and that was it breaks apart into 4 different colors: J, E, D, and P.
Yeah.
So if you were to be so moved, like I did back in grad school, I think, took a Bible and I went through with all these different colored highlighters, although they highlighted them different than I did, but anyway, and highlighted the Bible so that I could open up and know what am I reading right there, J, E, D, or P. And I would even follow along reading just the J or just the E or anything like that.
Please
It
tell
makes
me
for
what
interesting
J,
reading.
E, B, and P is.
What's that, sorry? What is it?
Yeah,
That's the 4 sources that gave us the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible.
okay.
J, what we call it J because he referred to God, or she referred to God as Yahweh, which in German starts with a J. So the E is the one who refers to God as El or Elo or Elohim, mostly Elohim. Then the D source is the Deuteronomist, the one who wrote the book of Deuteronomy and some of the other historical things that you would find in the Pentateuch. P is the priestly writer who contributed most of Leviticus because, of course, as it would sound, he's concerned with the priestly stuff, with all the counting and the rituals and the requirements and all that stuff. So, we've been talking specifically over the last few weeks about J and E because we're trying to go in a historical, or in a chronological sense. So we started off with Job because the core of Job is, without a doubt, the oldest part. But if you go back to the oral tradition of Job, when it was being passed down like as folklore, it goes way back. So far back we can't even really guess at a date. But it begins to then start taking shape and different editions come along and we wind up with what we have right now. Then came, we would say, the book of Genesis. That's the next thing kind of being written. And then Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all that will come along, and Deuteronomy will wind up being, one of the last of the bunch. So we've certainly covered a whole lot of ground in our investigation and the pursuit of J and E. In a lot of the stories that we've discussed, we've been able to find clues as to the story, the writer's world. We know that J was a southern historian in the kingdom of Judah. E was a northern historian in the kingdom of Israel in the north. We've talked at length about and pointed out all these clues so that we can become acquainted with the sequence of events with J and E. And it was important for us, we spent so much time on this because it's been important for us to kind of cement the arguments about this multiple authorship. For so long, remember, it was just, the legend was that Moses wrote all of it. Well, now we've seen that there's no way Moses could have written it because mostly, if nothing else, there was no written Hebrew language in the time of Moses. And there are those who even argue that Moses may have been a legendary figure himself. Okay, well, we won't go that way. This is the national saga. This is the story of the people of Israel, of the Hebrew nation, and this is the story that they tell about themselves. So we look at how many times there are points of intersection in these, that as we move towards a common direction of finding the support for these multiple author hypotheses in general, and identifying J and E in particular as those northern and southern historians. When we read all those stories and we read them individually, we get a better sense of what their world was like. What point were these authors trying to prove? We see the northern kingdom, that historian is really interested in supporting the whole idea of Jeroboam being the right king, the right guy. This is the guy who's supposed to be there because Rehoboam is this terrible guy. The southern historian isn't going to see it that way at all. The southern historian has got the temple in Jerusalem, and boy, we can shape the story how we want to because God has clearly given us the temple. The northern historian goes, no, not so fast. We also have sacred sites like Shechem in particular. We come to understand these stories then of what point each author is trying to make in supporting their kingdom. The J author supporting the southern kingdom, the E author supporting the north kingdom. And it's not just the development of those stories, it's a kind of a sympathetic development of those stories. The way those stories develop are trying to show, hey, look, we are the ones who are chosen by God. We are God's chosen people. We are the ones who have had all this special blessings poured out on us. We're the ones. And so everybody's story winds up supporting that hypothesis. We can look at like what am I thinking of? In chapter 11 of Exodus, where Moses is given this speech to God, and he's standing there and he's telling God, hey, look, why don't you just go ahead and kill me? Don't kill the people. And then God's like, no, you're a good guy. All right, I'll save the whole bunch of you. You know, we have this idea that's showing that God is really kind of ticked off with the people sometimes, but he has certain people, like Moses, who will make, God's wrath kind of turn aside. So it looks like sometimes Moses can no longer bear the burden that God has put on him and to manage this entire nation single-handedly. And so his plea to Yahweh is extraordinary because of the anguish that's there, the intimacy with God even. Moses says, why have you injured your servant? And why have I not found favor in your eyes to put the burden of this entire people on me? Did I conceive this entire people? Did I give birth to it? That you would say to me, carry it in your bosom. The way a nurse carries a suckling to the land that you swore to its fathers? From where do I have meat to give this entire people that they cry to me, saying, give us meat and let us eat? I'm not able myself to carry all of this people. It is too heavy for me. And if this is how you treat me, then kill me. If I have found favor in your eyes, and let me not see my suffering. Wow. Now, that's the J source, giving us this really intimate account of Moses and God. This is the kind of God that we can have this relationship with, the Yahwist is telling us. The Elohist is kind of like, no, it ain't like that at all. This is a guy you worry about. The Elohist is saying that this is an angry God. This is a God who doesn't really know mercy. Why? Because the Elohist is being influenced by the Canaanite religion in the north, where the God there is El, and they have Baal, the storm god. And those guys aren't nice. You can't cuddle up with the storm god, for crying out loud. But the Yahwist tells a different story altogether. this is a powerful composition reflecting this special interest, this special sympathy, this special affection for Moses. The E writer emphasizes the covenant with Moses at Horeb and never refers to the covenant of Abraham. The E story is telling us of the Exodus from Egypt and is telling us of how it's Moses' actions who free the people from Israel. The J source is saying, no, it was God. It was only God who freed us from Egyptian bondage. In fact, in the J source, Yahweh says, I am coming down to save them from Egypt's hand and to bring them up. Much more personal. But the E source says, and now go, and I shall send you to Pharaoh, talking to Moses. You take my people, my children of Israel, out of Egypt. Two different. So, the reason I suggest this is because you can read the J and the E, and you can see these guys have two different viewpoints altogether. One is much more intimate, the J source. One is much more sympathetic. And like I said last time, or the time before, that the J source is very concerned with those kind of relationships, and especially the role of women, which is why a guy named Harold Bloom wrote a book called The Book of J, and in it he proposes that J was a woman. That J, who is so concerned with intimacy and personal interaction and concerned with the stories of women, that this was probably someone who was educated in the royal court of the dynasty of David, someone who had been educated. And we always think that women were never educated in the ancient world, that women didn't receive any kind of special training, that women did. That's just not true at all. That was true maybe in the 1920s. It was true in America in some places, and certainly it was true during the Middle Ages and all that stuff. But in the ancient world, we can look at the education of women, and it was first class. We look at the book of Hebrews, for example, and here we are in the first century, and there's no doubt this is Priscilla who wrote this. She was from a noble Roman family. Her uncle and her grandfather had been consuls in the Roman government, and she herself was extremely well educated. That shows up. So this we find this huge difference between the two. The E writer focusing on Moses in this crucial personal role, and is consistent with the treatment of Moses throughout the whole work for him. The arrival of Moses at this great moment in history, the time of the covenant, the time of the birth of the nation, the time of Levi's first act of loyal service to God, all of those things fall within the E parameter. But in the Yahwist writer, in the J writer, we wind up having a writer who introduces us to God by name. Before, the Elohist writer is only talking about God. No name, just God. El or Elohim just means God, that's all. Yahweh is a name, and the Yahwist writer introduces us to Yahweh. And that's why there's so many differences between J and E, is even though they often tell similar stories, both of them are dealing largely with the same characters and they share much of the same terminology, but the stories are different. Why are they so different? Well, one possible explanation is that one of them is based on the other one. Could be. If one comes first, then it's definitely J who is going to come before E. The J source, we're probably talking about 825 to 850 BC. The E source, we're probably talking about 750. So anywhere between 75 and 100 years later, the E source is written. So there's an old Latin phrase, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. It's almost never true. But it always makes us think that because this thing came second, it must be based on the first thing, when maybe not. But still, the constant use of the same characters, same terminology, the details are in many cases right. It's kind of the interpretation of the story that's different. Maybe J was the Judean court account of the sacred national tradition. And so the northern Levites, those after the kingdom has divided, the 10 tribes in the north, those Levites up in the north are saying, well, we need to tell our story. We need to show why we are broken away, why we are the anointed ones too. It's not just them. Yeah, they have a temple and all like that, but we have Shechem and we have Samaria and we have all these other places that are just as important. And there's 10 tribes of us. So for crying out loud, the Judean court, wanting to keep their own particular version of the priesthood, the J source, because the E source now, they're treating Aaron as being the great cause of the priesthood, the great instigator of the priesthood. At least, I mean, that's the way it was being told in the South. The Northerners don't like that. They're wanting to have a different source of their priesthood. Now, the thing is these stories, they wouldn't have been welcome in the South or in the North. The Northerners, when they start reading about all this stuff that God did for the kingdom of David, the dynasty of David, did for all these other great characters, the way that Moses and Aaron are treated, the way that all that stuff, the Northerners are going, no, that we don't want that. So they don't want to bring the J document, as it existed, up into the North. So they write their own. But then, when they do write their own, the Southerners are going to go, we don't want that. We don't. Okay, imagine in the South in 1880, a Northern historian writes the story of the Civil War, and what a great general General Grant was. General Sherman was this determined, and Abraham Lincoln was the best president. The Southerners are going to go, no, they're not. And so you have a guy who is he was the editor of the Charleston Mercury, I think. His name was Pollard. Anyway, he wrote a book called The Lost Cause. He writes this book this is how noble the South were, because we fought to the end, and General Lee and General Jackson and all these great generals, they were good men who were... Okay, so the North reads that and go, no, not at all. The South reads the North, no. Can there come a time when the two sources are combined together? When there is an objective history that tells the story of the American Civil War and gives props to both sides? Maybe it hadn't happened yet, because the minute you read a book on the American Civil War, the first thing you want to do is look at, where's this guy from? Oh, he's from Mississippi. You know what he's going to think. And sure enough, he will, Even such a great historian... Okay, let me back up. Let me not call him a historian. He is a storyteller. A guy named Shelby Foote. He was from Mississippi. He had this kind of a twinkle in his eye. And when he was telling the story, and he would tell these individual stories, which were all terrific and charming, but he would have kind of a twinkle in his eye like, I know something you don't know, but I'm about to tell you. You gotta love that guy. But when you listen to him telling of the whole story, it's like, oh, why don't you go back to the little episodes? Like when he was talking about, for example, the siege of Vicksburg. And he says that there was all the Confederate soldiers under siege in Vicksburg, and the Union soldiers had them surrounded, and they started singing to each other. The Southerners would start singing these songs, and then the Northerners started answering back. Well, every war is full of stories like that. I mean, we think about the soccer game that was held between the British and the Germans in World War I. those are terrific stories. But when you come to start making history, well, your influences are going to play into it. And it certainly happens with these guys. The existence of one of these sources, existing in one of these kingdoms, is certainly going to be motivation for the other kingdom to start writing. In this case, E is going to start writing, the northern kingdom is going to start writing their version of it. But the two versions are just that. They're different versions of the same story. They're versions that are not completely unrelated to each other. They would still be drawing from a common treasury of their history, a common treasury of their tradition, because remember, Israel and Judah had once been a united kingdom, and trade and religion, all those things were shared in common between the two nations. In many ways, they were still kind of united. They spoke the same language. They shared a common history, at least until the time of the division of the kingdom. They had traditions regarding Abraham, Isaac, and Moses, and Jacob. They had the shared tradition of being slaves in Egypt. They had been released from slavery in Egypt. They had been helped by a man named Moses, whether or not it was Moses who did it all, or he was just the guy who, helped them along with God's instruction. We have them coming into the promised land. We have all these stories that are common to all of these peoples. Neither author, neither J nor E, are free to start making up stuff. Nor were they interested in making anything up. They weren't interested in creating some new and fictional portrayal of history. Both sides are trying to be honest to their history, but like happens, their motivations are different. And so the points are different. The two documents are rather similar in style. One version was, once one version was established, then anything that came out is going to kind of want to follow that terminology, that style, that kind of portrayal of the national sacred traditions. So the author of the second document becomes an alternate version of the first document, and especially once the first document becomes established in people's mind as being the proper way to tell a history, and a certain formal way to tell a history, and the familiar language of recounting these stories, then the second guy has got to follow suit and do a lot like it. Which is what makes it so incredible that those guys like Astruc and Eichhorn and De Wette, and then later on Wellhausen, were all able to say, these are different people. These are different writers. This isn't the same source. I can't tell you how impressive those guys are. A student of mine asked me one time, he goes, so when we all get to heaven, I said, thank you for that. When we all get to heaven, who's the first one you want to talk to? I said, well, God, because I want him to explain the 1969 World Series. How did the Orioles lose to the Mets there? I don't get that. I said, but yeah, other guys. I said, well, one of them is Julius Wellhausen. I want to talk to that guy. How could you divide them just like that? Was he the end all? No, they kept on figuring out that there were other supplying sources to the four documents and all like that. But still, to be able to look at a Hebrew document and go, these aren't the same, this isn't the same hand that did it. That's remarkable. So we look at these documents. The first document kind of establishes, think of it this way. If when the United States Constitution was written, that was the first of, that was the federal document. But then you look at the other states, the 13 states, and they start writing their constitutions. Well, they start writing their constitutions to look like the federal constitution, because they've accepted this is the style, this is the way it should be written, this is the way we want. It doesn't look like anything the Brits did. The British, Magna Carta was basically just telling the king to shut up and get in line and listen to the barons, and that was about it. The U.S. Constitution breaks up the three branches of government, and so you wind up having the same thing in all the other states. We have a governor, the executive branch. We have a state Supreme Court. We have houses of the legislature. So all the states start copying that. We're talking about the same thing here. And it's not necessarily that the stylistic similarity of J and D isn't that J is based on E or E is based on J. Both of them may have been based on something else, a common source that both of them were referring to. Now you start getting a little iffy, because it's like proposing a document because of the absence of a document. That doesn't hold up logically. You can't prove a thing by the absence of a thing. Okay, so, but there were those, just in full disclosure, there were those who said maybe there was a document that the two of these copied from. Well, if there was anything that they copied from, it would have been, once again, the oral tradition. The stories that were being passed down by word of mouth, being passed down by these great storytellers who would recite them on the high holy days, and we know that happened. I mean, even the text of the scripture tells us that, there were, certain rituals that were set on the steps of the temple. All right, so we know that existed. But I think at the end of the day, we're going with the two documents. Instead of two from a different source, it's two who are independently written. They're sharing the history, remember, and all the other things. And in either case, once the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were established, independent, the authors, J and E, each adapted their collection of their respective concerns and purposes to support the kingdoms in which they live. They're not going to tell good stories about each other because we're trying to keep everybody here and not have this migration going on because all of a sudden the North Kingdom looks so much better. No, we're going to tell the stories that why everybody should stay here. Pardon me. So, how many authors were there? We've talked about those two, and we could be more specific about who these two people were. When they lived, what their identity is. First, there's the question of whether they were really only two persons. Well, now, Wellhausen and the rest said, we got four authors, and these two, J and E. But some scholars see J and E as each having been produced by groups and not as individuals. That this was, for example, the school of J or the guild of E or whatever. And some of them will talk about J1, J2, J3. Well, that just clearly it made me pull my hair out. That's just... You can't break it down quite that nicely. It doesn't work that way. And there were scholars in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, even into the last ones were probably in the 80s, who were saying, no, we can show this. Now, that fragment of J1, 2, and 3, and E1, 2, and 3 is pretty much been concluded that there's no evidence to lead us down that path. The things that are different, the things that were added in there, is a result of the Deuteronomist, D, adding some historical notes, and especially the priestly writer, P, writing in the religious details, the ritual details. So J and E appear to be unified and consistent as they are in the text as we've reviewed them, and especially when you start looking at it, if you can, looking at the different documents here. Let me explain this chart a little bit. So when you see up at the top Genesis, If you could, well, you can see Genesis, that one's not so bad. But then off to the side on the far left, you'll see 1. It's actually out of the colored zone. So there's that 1. Okay, that's chapter 1.
Right.
Okay. And then, I knew I didn't need to explain it to you, but, you know. Then you see, so 1, then 1 through 31 is simply talking about, you got it, the verses. And then the next part, still part of P, is chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 in the first part of chapter 4, which is about the principle of the Sabbath. Then it goes into the J material, and then there's the editor, the descendants of Abraham. The descendants of Adam. That was added by the editor much later on. So anyway, there you kind of got it. And then Exodus, Leviticus, and all like that. This one throws me a little bit only because for me, J was yellow and E was blue. And so I look at this, that's why I always look at J and go, or look at the yellow and go, oh yeah, the J source. Oh no, it's not. It's priestly. Anyway, so.
So, can I ask it?
Sure.
So the yellow is the priest, and the pink is the
Yahwist, J?
J.
Yeah.
It tells you at the bottom.
Actually,
Oh,
look
what
at
does
those.
it tell you?
Yeah,
At the bottom,
I'm sorry.
yeah.
where those.
You see the paragraphs written there?
Down there.
Oh, down here?
Yep.
Okay.
You'll
all right.
see the pink one says J. Materials in pink used.
Now
with
I
vinyl.
see it,
Okay.
okay.
Yeah, so this was done not too many years ago by, as it says, a guy named Brian Arthur Brown. And yeah, he kept me from having to do it, so God bless Brian Brown. And actually, I didn't find anything to disagree with in his assessment of that, so that was pretty good stuff.
Of Protestant churches, do most of them accept this now? Or no? Is it?
Lutherans will,
Okay.
Presbyterians will, Methodists will,
Okay.
Baptists, not so much.
Do all Lutherans accept it?
I haven't heard anybody who didn't.
Oh, that's interesting. Oh.
Yeah, but what I'm talking about is basically in the seminaries. You know, this is what would be taught in the seminary. Does it get preached from the pulpit? Not so much, no. Because mostly in the pulpits, sorry, this doesn't sound right, but I'm going to say it. In the pulpits, it's mostly a moralizing.
Right, yeah, it's
kind of
totally
preaching.
different stuff.
It is,
Yeah.
you know, and that's just,
Yeah, you wouldn't get that anyway,
yeah,
because that would
yeah.
create a lot of confusion and.
Oh, sure. And which is why this is going to be, you know, reserved for, I mean, you won't hear me talking in the pulpit. So in the P source, P source, what are we talking about? Talking about some kind of urinary problem or so?
I just read an article about the Southern Baptist,
Yeah.
how it got taken over by Pressler,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and how, well, first of all, how adamant he was and all kinds of other things, that all of which are bad. I couldn't
Mhm.
find anything good, and it was
Yeah.
happening here. But does that, what he's quoting and saying is the way you have to go, more this, not God as the Yahweh song, you know, the warm one.
Right.
He was much more these are the rules one.
Yes.
So it's the same story, but it can be viewed either militantly or.
Here's the difference. And this is something I actually taught the confirmation class last year when we were getting to the Ten Commandments. And so at the end of the year, I just asked them, hey, would you fill out, you know, what things would you like to change? What things do you want to keep? What meant the most to you? And I was stunned at how many of them said the discussion on the Ten Commandments meant the most. And I was like, really? I gave you such cool stuff, and that's what you're gonna, you know. And so I asked one of them, I said, so why that? Oh, it was because you said the 10 Commandments isn't prescriptive, it's descriptive. Now, that's the ball game. If you look at the Torah, the law, which actually should be counted or translated more like traditions or teaching, if you look at it as prescriptive, then it means when I bear false witness or I covet my neighbor's car or whatever, I've broken a commandment. Oh no, I've broken a commandment. What am I? And it's this horrifying, legalistic, burdensome approach. And what I told them was, rather, when you do any of those things that the commandments say not to, your first response should be, what is broken in me? Don't worry about breaking the commandment. What's broken in you that would cause you to do such a thing? There's the difference, because those people, the legalists, want to say this is prescriptive. This is the way we must act. The descriptive approach is more like, this is a description of what the redeemed life should look like. And when we go astray from that, what is broken inside of us? One of them is thumping the law all the time, the prescriptive approach. Otherwise, most of us are saying this is how we should look, and when we go astray, then we start to examine ourselves instead of cowering in front of an angry God. Oh, for crying out loud, that guy Jonathan Edwards way back wrote that terrible sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God.
Really?
Well, that'll scare you into redemption, but is it going to keep you there? I mean, I don't think it does. I mean, it's like my dad always used to describe sermons like that and conversion like that as being fire insurance. That people are just afraid of going to hell, and so, I'll do. When we're told in the New Testament, don't you know it is the kindness of God that draws us to redemption?
It reminds me of what
Yeah.
Sarah said she just heard, which was if the only thing, no, okay, I'm gonna get it wrong, but if the thing that you are most afraid of is going to hell, that means you are tethered to the devil.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with God.
Right. Absolutely right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tethered to the devil. What an awful way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Whereas,
When we were growing up and stuff, we never heard the word grace like
Right.
we
Oh,
do
no.
now.
right.
And it wasn't like we had the fire and brimstone type preaching, but I mean, what a beautiful thing to think that we can be just surviving by grace.
You know,
Absolutely.
I had
You know,
the experience of Sarah's like 18 months old, and took her to church for whatever. I mean, why would you be taking any? To which, and she was good. To which my mother's response was, "Oh, God really is proud of her."
Right.
And I had no idea what, it was like, I'm just glad she didn't cry. What an odd thing to say, but that's how it was when we went to church. It was like you had to do it.
Sure.
Don't you dare sit down if they say stand up,
Right.
kind of a deal.
Which is why the Bible so many times by, I'm going to say lapsed Christians, but what I mean is people who stopped attending and they're just tired of, the
Yeah.
noise. They wind up calling the Bible the book of rules. And that's tragic. It's not a book of rules. It's a book of, this is how these people tried to get through life. This is what they thought God was giving to them to help them survive through troublesome times. And I mean, not just external times, but troublesome times in ourselves. How to wrestle with ourselves. In the Lord's Prayer, when we pray and deliver us from evil, my dad and I were talking about this not too long ago. I said, there was another version of that way back, and it was deliver us from the evil one. I said, and sometimes I find myself saying that, going back to that one. Terrible thing being a church historian, because you remember all the old stuff and you can't remember the more revised stuff.
The good ones.
Yeah, the good one, yeah. That's right. And so my dad said, that strikes me funny that you would say that. That, are you that concerned with the devil? And I'm like, well, I'm not talking about him. I'm talking about the evil one inside of me, the evil one that lurks inside of me. God deliver me from that. And he was like, that makes perfect sense. And he goes, okay, I completely get that. I mean, when we talk about the devil, I think about the scriptures that say we're going to see him on that day and go, that's who we're afraid of? We're afraid of that guy? So, I don't sweat that, but the things that I might be influenced to do, that I want to be delivered from. So, once again, it's grace and love that saves the day. And even if it's somebody like David who committed atrocities, still, God said, this is a guy after my own heart. And the Bible is full of stories, with the exception of Jesus. It's full of stories of people who are lousy human beings, and yet God uses them anyway. That's got to be good news for us, is, wow, God can use anybody, and will use anybody. Even Moses, who, whether he lived or not, killed the two guys, the Egyptians. So anyway, yeah, the Southern Baptists and most of the Baptists are probably going to say no. They won't hold to that. The Pentecostals are definitely going to say no, because they believe that God spoke to Moses, and Moses wrote all this down. And even if you present them, and I have, present them with, but what about that passage where Moses says, or where the author says in Deuteronomy that there has never been a prophet like Moses, even unto this day? How could Moses have right then? Because Moses was a prophet. Okay, so I got an answer for everything. If you're gonna be stuck with something, you'll find any way to, find something to make it count that way. For me, it's, and I've said it before, but it's a much more beautiful story. I'm so in love with the scriptures, even with finding out what some people would say, oh, you have doubts about this. No, I don't. These are people who are trying to explain how we got here and what our relationship with God is like. Well, that means my life is a Bible too, so is yours. That we have a Bible inside of us that tells our story about how we got here and who got us here. Well, going back to J&E, and this is going to be pretty much the end of our discussion of those two, and then we're going to go on and talk about the next ones in chronological order, and you're going to be talking about, Amos. This is where the prophets start showing up then, the earliest of the prophets, Amos and Micah and some of the others. And from here on, you're going to see different, the D source isn't going to show up until probably 550 BC. Well, you got 200 years of prophets in the meantime. The P source, probably not going to show up until 500 or 450 BC. So, yeah, after this, but I still want to just wrap up J and E because they're so remarkable. So, the sex of the authors. The author of E, almost certainly a male. We've seen the strong connection of the document, the E document with the Levite priests, and the connection with Shiloh. And in ancient Israel, the North Kingdom, well, all of them, the priesthood was strictly male. It's the guys who are going to be the priest. And we find in E a predominantly male point of view, a male perspective with a concentration on male characters. And that suggests the the possibility, if not certainty, that this is male authorship we're talking about. Also remembering that this is a patriarchal society, and that with the male priesthood, it's doubtful that a document that was to have some kind of a formal, sacred status in the kingdom would have been either commissioned or accepted from the hands of a woman. But the case with Jay is much more difficult. Jay reflected the interests of the Judean court, and it came from a circle where both men and women had elevated status, where both men and women were educated. Even in this male-led society, women of the noble class still had more power and privilege and education than even males of the lower classes. So the possibility of Jay coming from the hand of a woman is much more likely than is the case with E. There's really nothing in E to compare with the story of that we find in J, the story of Tamar in Genesis 38. I don't know if you remember that story. Do we have the? All right. Come on here.
Tamar's vindication, it says in 4 point.
All right, starting in verse 1. It happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adulamite woman whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went in to her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Again she conceived and bore a son, whom she named Onan. Yet again she bore a son, and she named him Shelah. She was in Kezib when she bore him. Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. We don't know how, and we don't know what he did, but he's put to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother." Pause. The rule was, if a man's brother died and left the wife with no children, therefore no heirs, then it's the brother's responsibility to go and impregnate the sister-in-law, which in normal cases would be considered incest, but this was the law back then. He's supposed to go in, and then if she has a son, then he's to raise that child as the heir of his brother. What if she has a daughter? Well, sorry, take one for the team and go in there again. Holy smokes! So, yeah, these are things that you won't find in the texts of our sermons on Sundays. So, anyway, here's the story. But once Onan knew that his offspring would not be his, he spilled his semen on the ground whenever he went in to his brother's wife. So he's going in to have some action, but there's no way she's getting pregnant. Yeah, not a Sunday school story here. What he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. So the Lord's on a killing spree here because, yeah, this poor woman. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he feared that he too would die, like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Yeah, that's as far as we want to go. Yeah, so this is a very sympathetic story to this poor woman whose first off, the poor woman, her husband has died, and now she's got the freaky brother-in-law who's going to be coming over, and she's supposed to welcome him, and every time he's supposed to do the deed, well, he, you know, tragic. So then Judah says, no, we're not gonna have it that way. You come, you live in my house, I will take you in as my own. So she goes into, this is a terrific story on Judah's behalf, but the sons are, yeah. So here in chapter 38, it's not just that the woman figures in an important way in this story, it's the story that is sympathetic to the wrong that has been done to her. And it focuses on her plan to combat the injustice, concluding with the man of the story, Judah himself, acknowledging her own rights and his fault. He recognizes just how complicit he was in the story. There's nothing to dissuade us from the possibility that a woman might very well have composed a work that came to be loved and valued in that land. So where did they live? Well, you pretty much know that already. Or when did they live? Since the J narrative refers to the dispersion of Simeon and Levi, but not to the dispersion of the other tribes, its author certainly would have written before the Assyrians conquered the North Kingdom. That happened in 722. That was before the fall of the Northern Kingdom and the dispersal of the 10 tribes, but Simeon and Levi have been dispersed. So we're kind of moving us now back to around 850, 848, something like that. Also, the stories of Jacob and Esau kind of reflect. Remember, we talked about how Edom was where Jacob went, and that was became his homeland, and the people who were raised up after them. And the prophecy was told them that you will shake off the yoke of Judah. Well, that does happen. But again, that's going to be somewhere before 750. So the author of J then composed in Israel somewhere as early as 922, but that's way too early, and as late as 722, and that's probably too late. Again, the number we probably want to stick with is about 850 BC. But it really is difficult to narrow it down just based on the evidence. The most important point is that both J and E were written before the Assyrians destroyed Israel, 722. At that time, the Assyrians carried out the deportation of the entire Israelite population. But also during that time, many of the people of the north would have fled south because down in Judah, they speak our language. Down in Judah, and they got the temple down there too. It's kind of like good news, bad news kind of a thing. We want to get out of the north. We want to get out of the Assyrians' domination, and we definitely don't want to be deported. So let's go south. So they went there where they had a common history, a common language, common religion, and you can guess that these Levites who escaped down there would have been carrying along their little copy of E. So the E source now makes its way down to where the J source is. And somebody says, maybe we could do something with the two of these. Well, so there would have been a whole lot of Israelites who fled into Judah as refugees, and archaeological excavations confirm that there was a massive expansion around that time, around that very same time. Jerusalem grew really substantially during that time, and the likely scenario, like I said, is that the E text came to Judah in the flow of the people from the North Kingdom. They were kin with the Judeans. Again, spoke the same language. They had the same God, Yahweh, even though they might call him by different names, still, that was considered their God. They shared ancestral traditions. They shared the history of the patriarchs. And again, like I said, the Exodus, the wandering in the wilderness, and all that stuff. But what were they supposed to do now with two documents that tell the same story but different emphasis? Each one is claiming to recount the sacred history of the national traditions while emphasizing different persons and events, and even sometimes contradicting each other a little bit. Well, the solution, of course, is to combine them. Now, why combine them? Why not just take one and go, nah, this isn't, and toss it aside? Only keep the one. Well, why would he not simply keep the one? Some editor or some compiler keep one and leave out the other. Why not just make E, or more likely J, the accepted text and reject or ignore the other one? One well-used answer is that the biblical community had far too much respect for the written word to ignore any document. I mean, clearly, they've already brought a whole book of wisdom called the Wisdom of Anonymity from Egypt, because this was recognized wisdom. So they brought it along. It became part of our book of Proverbs. Certain psalms were taken from Canaanite worship that accurately described how we feel about God. So yeah, they definitely had a great respect, if not love, for the written word. And remember, the written word isn't that old. I mean, we look now, just like, oh, what? Somebody came into my house and they're like, why you got so many books? If we were in that time, this would have been considered wealth beyond measure to have books like that. And so, well, these were scrolls, of course. But anyway, so they really respected and wanted to keep them. So they couldn't just ignore this scroll that had the stamp of authenticity and antiquity on it. But there's probably a more reasonable or even probable answer. And both J and E were both kept because both of them had become sufficiently well known to the extent that one couldn't simply just get away with it. I mean, with putting it aside. People would start asking, hey, especially the refugees from Israel, hey, what happened to that? Remember that book we brought? Whatever became of that anyway? Where can we go check that out of the library? Oh, well, we buried that someplace or burned it or whatever. No, it was too well known by that point. Okay, imagine if this day, if all of a sudden Bibles disappeared, we would start asking questions. Even people who are not necessarily churchgoers or even concerned with the Bible, they would be like, well, wait a minute, where did that go? Think of it like that. So you can't just get away with putting aside a document like that. To whatever extent the J and E narratives had become known by this time, it was necessary to preserve them both. So why combine them at all? Why not just have over here is J and over here is E? Why not have them kept separately? Well, again, the answer to that's relatively simple too. Preserving J and E separately would wind up challenging the authenticity of both of them. Because you would wind up having people going, well, I think E is right, and others, I think J is right. And you would wind up having division over your history, for crying out loud. If both were kept side by side on the same shelf, that would present a dual history that were preserved from two separate accounts. And that would diminish the authoritative quality of both of them. No, they want to have one book that is absolutely the authority. So the process of combining. Editing the two works into one was as much a political and social consideration as the writings of them had been in the first place. The uniting of the two works reflected kind of a uniting, or better yet, a reuniting of these two communities who had been separated for 200 years at this point. By the time of this coming together, it's been 200 years since the North Kingdom broke away from the Kingdom of Judah. We still have a whole lot that could be discovered about who wrote what. We don't know the precise dates when they lived, and we don't even know their names. But when we come back to discuss D, who may have been the editor also, he may have been fulfilling two roles, we can know much more about him than we do about J and E. And we may even know D's name. And it's one of my favorite stories of history. There is, I don't want to jump too far ahead, but one suggestion is that the D source might have been Baruch, who was the secretary, the scribe for Jeremiah. And when you read Jeremiah, when Jeremiah has been taken away by people who are escaping down into Egypt, and they kidnap Jeremiah and take him with them, Baruch prays and about what's going to happen to him, and the Lord says, don't worry. I can't promise you success. I can't promise you wealth. I can't promise you anything like that, but I'll give you your life. You will have your life. And in one translation, one version says, and I will give you ongoing life. All right, that sounds nice. And it makes us think about heaven or something like that. Maybe something a little more closer to home. We don't have any document from the hand of any of the biblical writers, Old Testament, New Testament. With the New Testament, the earliest we've got is basically a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. No original documents. But a discovery was made in Sinai where they found a jar, and the jar was empty, but there was a seal. What they would do is they would take cloth and soak it in plaster, sort of, and put the documents in this jar, and then cover the jar with this plaster seal it tight, usually like with a string or something to bind it really tight. And then, of course, as that plaster hardens, well, it's not moving. And it was sealed with the owner or the author's name. They found a seal, and it says the Scroll of Baruch. That's awesome. I mean, to think that, you know what, that was the promise of the Lord too, to give him ongoing life, and that even his signature would be the only thing we have from a biblical writer. That's a good story. So next time when we come back, we will be jumping into the prophets and moving on from there. Moving on pretty quickly. Spent a lot of time with J.E., I know, I understand, but that just has a huge, and the scholarship that helps us to determine that will help us to determine later writers too, like Isaiah, for example. We wind up finding that there are 3 Isaiahs, and they wound up being edited into one. And when we get there and we talk about, you can even start to look at the different chapter breaks and go, wait a minute, why is this saying that? Okay, for example, rise, shine, for your light has come, and the Spirit of the Lord has risen upon you. Wow, that's great. Well, that was written by the Isaiah who was in Babylonian captivity, and they had just been told, you get to go home. Now, you read back the first Isaiah, chapters 1 through 39, and it's got nothing to do with the Babylonians. The problem is the Assyrians. Okay, so Isaiah is writing somewhere back in the 700s, and he will write a good amount of work, but then there will be another Isaiah who is witnessing the deportation of the Jews to Babylon, and then there's an Isaiah who gets to come home. Anyway, and again, it was Wellhausen and those guys who helped us start to figure out how some of those things work. And when we get to Psalm, oh good grief, there's more authors of Psalms than as my dad used to say, then you can shake a stick at. And I know what that means. So, there we have it. Do you have any questions or anything about anything?
You know, it occurs to me that I haven't appreciated how, just the writing of something, putting it down, however, the work it would have taken, you wouldn't be scribbling notes.
No.
So to find something would have meant it was important enough to write down.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why you're not going to, you know, bury one of those books in the backyard.
That's right. You're not going to find an ancient grocery list because paper or even vellum, sheepskin, is way too expensive. And even the making of the ink was expensive. And, you know, modern science and chemistry can give us a lot of help in discovering that we can find the writings, even though it looks like it's disappeared to us, with certain medical imaging now. You can look at certain things and you can see where the effect on the paper or the vellum took place. Even though you can't see it with your eyes, the machinery can pick it up. And it tells a cool story. We also find out that there were people who were messing around with the texts. People who were doing some erasing and writing in something else. Again, we can now not only see that there was an erasure, we can see what the first word was. A guy named Bart Ehrman, a biblical scholar, he has on his wall a copy of this ancient text, and I don't remember which the text was, but clearly somebody had done some erasing and rewriting, and some scholar from the 700s AD had written in the margin, "Fool and knave, leave the original text alone." So even by 700, they were able to see somebody's messing around with it. Origen, he's writing about the year 170, I think, and he was talking about the way people were twisting his writings, and he says in one place, "And if they're doing it to me, you know they did it to the words of the Savior." And by 170, they're already starting to see that things were being fooled around with. And certain things were left out. Not only changing, but like, for example, we all know the text, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of them. Sounds good. But in the Gospel according to Thomas, which was just a collection of the sayings of Jesus, there's no narrative, no anything like that, Jesus said, it says, what is it? Saying number 112, I think. He says, Jesus said to his disciples, "Where 2 or 3 are together in my name, there I am in the midst of them." But, he goes on, "Where there are 4 or 5 or 6, I'm nowhere to be found." Goodness. He was worried about when you start getting large groups, you start seeing a human agenda. You start seeing politics. You start seeing, and so Jesus was apparently warning us, be careful about that stuff, because you wind up departing from the gospel and you wind up just, and that's what church history is just a struggle of denominations and people who were more concerned with politics than what the Lord was saying.
Or with rules.
Say again?
With rules.
Yes, absolutely, with rules.
So you could do a whole sermon on,
Wow.
okay, let's divide up into 3s here because
Yeah, that's right.
we can't have you all together.
That's right.
Or the politics.
Interesting. It makes the Bible go more real. It makes the people, ancient people, more relatable too.
Yes.
Because how could they be any different from that? I mean,
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, to think that they were so. This was way before the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you wanted to go see somebody, like when Jesus went to see Lazarus, it was only, 12 miles southeast of Jerusalem? And yet it was considered a day's march,
it's a
for
long
us.
walk.
And you walk, that's right.
Wow.
Not everybody's riding a horse or a donkey or anything like that, or certainly not a camel. Yeah, it's a whole different, so how amazing that these people could be really that sophisticated,
Yeah.
you know?
Oh, but we're too arrogant.
Oh, we just are, yeah,
Well, I'm amazed at how they figured out how to preserve this stuff.
yeah, yeah.
Because if they wrote it down, they had to know how to preserve it for future generations.
And imagine what was lost during that process, because there are certain inks that will absolutely destroy papyrus because of the metals that are in the ink. It will eat through it. So imagine what we lost. You know, who knows? Because we start reading the books of the Kings and the book of Samuel and Chronicles. They are referencing other books that existed in their time. But we don't have them, and not yet. I hope they keep digging. Why don't they stop shooting?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is-
Definitely.
That's amazing.
Now, do the Ogama people know that it's supposed to freeze tonight?
But
Well, they've got the air conditioner on. I'm like, that is expensive. That's an expense.